Another week, another great episode. Haunted Skin, Early Christianity, and the Incarnational Redemption of Touch, Part 2.
In part one, we began this series that arises from an original article on Substack by Yap with Sarah. When you are not touched, so you touched the lie sex keeps telling you. Part two of our exploration, we move from the diagnosis of the ghost to the idea of the grip. When touch becomes a ghost, haunting us with its absence or its transactional hollows, the human nervous system enters a state of chronic alarm. Contemporary trauma research, such as that by Bessel van der Kolk, confirms that the brain's sociomotor cortex doesn't just crave contact, it can demand attunement. This is where the laboratory of modern dating fails us, offering the great pretender, the platters of digital proximity while leaving our souls so lonesome I could cry. To find the body's true language, we must return to the radical incarnational logic of the second century church. For Irenaeus of Lyon, the human frame was never a biological machine, but the clay constantly handled by the two hands of God, the Son and the Spirit. As Athanasius would later argue in the 4th century, the Word became flesh specifically to hollow the very skin we inhabit, moving us from a contractual use of the body to a covenantal indwelling. We're looking for more than a sensation. We are searching for the healing hem Sam Cooke wrote about and sang in 1956, the kind of touch that doesn't just occupy space, but restores the soul to its original sacred center.
Indeed, so Mr. Mac in article is describing the degradation of touch, using it wrongly and reaping emptiness. What would the redemption of touch look like in early Christians' thought? How is touch restored to its proper purpose?
This is where early Christianity becomes profoundly hopeful because it's not ultimately a no to embodiment or touch, but a resounding yes to touch in its fullest, most meaningful form. The redemption of touch begins, remarkably, with God Himself choosing to be touched. The incarnation is God's validation that bodies matter, that touch is holy, that physical intimacy has profound spiritual significance. Consider the gospel narratives. Jesus is constantly touching and being touched. He touches lepers, social and religious outcasts. He allows a sinful woman to wash his feet with her tears and hair. He takes children into his arms. He washes the disciples' feet. He invites Thomas to touch his wounds. Every one of these touches communicates something: dignity, forgiveness, inclusion, service, proof of reality. Touch in Jesus' ministry is restored to its purpose as communication, connection, healing, and revelation. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in the late 2nd century, has this phrase in Against Heresies: the glory of God is a human being fully alive. He's arguing against Gnostic contempt for the body. God doesn't want disembodied spirits. He wants embodied humans flourishing in their full psychosomatic integrity. The incarnation proves this. God doesn't escape the body, He assumes it. Christ's body is real, touchable, wounded, resurrected, and it remains embodied even in glory. This is Christianity's absolute validation of the body's goodness and eternal significance. Now, how does this translate to sexual touch specifically? Paul in Ephesians 5:28 and 29 writes, "Husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. Who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church." Notice the analogy. The way you care for your own body's genuine needs is how you should approach your spouse's body. This assumes that bodies have genuine needs for nourishment, rest, pleasure, affection, and that meeting those needs in appropriate context is good and godly. John Chrysostom preaches extensively on Christian marriage, and he's remarkably positive about sexual intimacy within marriage. In his homilies on Ephesians, he argues that husband and wife become one flesh, not just in the moment of sexual union, but through the sustained mutual care, pleasure, vulnerability, and knowledge they share over the years. The sexual act is an icon, a physical manifestation, of a deeper spiritual and personal reality. Two lives genuinely shared, two histories intertwined, two futures jointly built. Here's where touch is redeemed when it's embodied in covenant. The article describes a touch that promises everything and delivers nothing because there's no covenant structure to hold it. But touch within marriage, within permanent, exclusive, publicly witnessed commitment, can actually deliver on its implicit promises. When your body says, I give myself entirely to you, your life circumstances are backing up that claim with legal, social, spiritual, and practical commitment. The body isn't lying anymore. Clement of Alexandria, in his instructor, argues that sexual pleasure within Christian marriage is not merely tolerated, but celebrated, provided it's integrated with the other dimensions of the relationship: spiritual partnership, friendship, shared mission, mutual service. He critiques both hedonism, sex as pure pleasure seeking, and asceticism, rejection of pleasure as inherently suspect. Instead, he proposes integration. Pleasure is good when it's not divorced from meaning, when the physical and spiritual are united rather than split. There's a passage in Song of Songs 7:10 where the beloved says, I belong to my beloved, and his desire is for me. Notice the order: belonging first, then desire. In the redemptive vision, desire flows from belonging, not the reverse. You don't have sex to create belonging. You have sex to express and celebrate the belonging that already exists through covenant. This completely reorders the logic of casual intimacy, which tries to use sexual touch to manufacture connection. Augustine, for all his complicated personal history with sexuality, actually affirms sexual pleasure in marriage in his later writings. In On the Good of Marriage, he lists three goods of marriage: children, fidelity, and covenant. Within that framework, sexual pleasure is not just permitted, but expected. The marital bed is the place where these three goods converge: openness to life, exclusive faithfulness, and permanent commitment. And pleasure is the gift that God provides to encourage and sustain this covenant over decades. Here's the practical dimension that early Christians understood: touch in covenant has memory and anticipation. When you've been married for years, every touch carries the memory of previous touches: the awkward early attempts, the passionate reunions, the gentle comfort during grief, the celebratory exuberance, the mundane Tuesday mornings. And every touch anticipates future touches. You'll do this again. You'll learn each other more deeply. You'll adapt as bodies age and change. This historical and future dimension gives depth to physical intimacy that's impossible in casual encounters, where every touch exists in an eternal, disconnected present. Maximus the Confessor argues in his theological works that humans are meant to be microcosms, little universes that integrate matter and spirit, body and soul, time and eternity. Sexual intimacy in marriage is a place where all these dimensions converge. It's physical pleasure with spiritual meaning. It's momentary ecstasy that's embedded in lifelong commitment. It's personal vulnerability with communal, familial, social, ecclesial significance. When all these dimensions are present, touch becomes what it was meant to be: a form of communion that engages the whole person. The redemption of touch also requires what the tradition calls training, discipline, not the rejection of pleasure, but the ordering of desire. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 9:25 to 27 about athletes who train rigorously for a perishable crown, then says Christians should show similar discipline for an imperishable one. He even says, I discipline my body and keep it under control. This isn't hatred of the body, it's training it to function according to its true purpose rather than being enslaved to impulse. The article describes people who can't touch when they're lonely. They're compulsive, driven. Early Christianity would say that's slavery, not freedom. Real freedom is having desires that are aligned with your values and goals, having a body that serves your personhood rather than a personhood that's enslaved to bodily impulses. The ascesis, the training, is learning to wait, to sit with loneliness, to channel desire appropriate so that when you do touch, it's a gift rather than a compulsion. There's also a communal dimension to redemption that the article lacks. Early Christians understood sexual ethics not just for individual choices, but as communal formation. You weren't figuring out sexuality alone. You were being formed by a community that modeled healthy relationships, that held you accountable, that celebrated marriages, that provided alternatives to sexual activity for the unmarried. The person in the article seems isolated, making desperate choices in loneliness. The church, at its best, offers a different story. You're held by a community even when you're not held by a spouse. Gregory the Great, writing in the 6th century, talks about the wound of sin being healed gradually, not instantly. The person whose sexuality has been disordered by years of using bodies to medicate loneliness isn't going to experience immediate redemption. It's a process, a relearning of what touch means, a reinterpretation of body and soul, a gradual alignment of desire with covenant. But the process is possible because of the incarnation. Christ's assumption of human flesh means human flesh can be healed, reordered, and ultimately glorified. The ultimate vision is eschatological, looking towards the resurrection. Paul argues in 1 Corinthians 15 that our bodies will be raised and transformed. These bodies, the same ones that experience loneliness, desire, pleasure, and pain, will be redeemed and glorified. That means the body story doesn't end in decay or dismissal. It ends in transformation and eternal flourishing. This should shape how we treat bodies now, ours and others. Everybody is a future glory, a work in progress towards resurrection. In conclusion, early Christianity redeems touch by embedding it in the incarnation's validation of embodiment, covenant's framework of commitment, and community's formation of desire, offering not the rejection of sexual intimacy, but its fulfillment in context that honor both body and soul as integrated dimensions of the person God is making whole.
God make us whole. That amazing, Mr. Meg. The article hints at a deeper issue of underneath the loneliness and castle sex. People feeling unworthy, trying to prove they desirable or valuable through being wanted sexually. How did early Christians understand this question's worthiness and the shame of drives people to seek validation through bodies?
This is the wound underneath the wound. The article's subjects aren't just lonely, they're trying to answer a fundamental existential question. Am I worth loving? Do I have value? Am I real? And they're asking their bodies to provide the answer, which those bodies cannot do. Early Christianity has a radically different story about where worthiness comes from, and it begins not with what you do or what others think of you, but with those you are. Let's start with Genesis. Before the fall, Adam and Eve are naked and unashamed. There's no sense of unworthiness, no need to hide, no compulsion to prove value through performance or appearance. They simply are, and they know themselves as created by God, which is sufficient. The shame enters with sin, and notice that the immediate response is to hide, to cover, to become invisible. Shame makes you want to disappear, to become a ghost, which is exactly the feeling the article describes after casual sex. But here's what's crucial: God's response to shame isn't condemnation, it's pursuit. God asks, "Where are you?" He comes looking for the ones who are hiding. And while there are consequences for sin, God Himself makes garments to cover them. The first act of redemption is scripture is God clothing those who tried to hide from him. This establishes a pattern. Shame makes us hide, but God seeks us out. Shame makes us cover ourselves inadequately. God provides adequate covering. Fast forward to Jesus. In John 8, there's the woman caught in adultery, dragged into public view, about to be stoned. She's experiencing the ultimate shame, sexual sin exposed, death imminent, surrounded by accusers. Jesus' response is remarkable. He doesn't minimize her sin, but he doesn't pile on shame either. He says to her accusers, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone." They leave. Then Jesus asks her, "Women, where are they? No one has condemned you." She says, "No." He responds, "Neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." Notice the order: acceptance first, then transformation. Not get clean and then I'll accept you, but you're already accepted. Now grow into the life that flows from that acceptance. That is the Christian answer to unworthiness. Your value doesn't come from performance, sexual or otherwise. It comes from being created in God's image and being so valued that Christ died for you. Paul writes in Romans 5 through 8, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While, not after we cleaned up, not after we proved ourselves. While we were still a mess, we were deemed worth dying for. That's your worth. Augustine, reflecting on his own sexual sin in Confessions, describes years of trying to prove his worth through conquest and pleasure. He kept multiple mistresses, sought validation through sexual prowess, and tried to fill the emptiness with bodies. None of it worked. What finally healed him wasn't achieving sexual purity first and then finding God's acceptance. It was encountering God's pursuing love while he was still in sin, and that love gradually transformed his desires. He describes God as the beauty so ancient and so new that outshone all the false beauties he'd been chasing. When you see the real thing, the counterfeits lose their appeal. There's a profound psychological insight here that the desert fathers understood. Shame thrives in darkness, in hiding, in isolation. That's why the person in the article feels like a ghost. They're hiding their true self even while naked with someone else. The antidote to shame isn't more hiding, it's exposure to a gaze that sees you fully and loves you anyway. John Climacus, in The Ladder of Divine Ascent, talks about confession, but more broadly, the practice of becoming visible, of letting yourself to be known. It's terrifying and healing. That is why the Christian community matters. You need people who know your struggles, your failures, your shame, and who remain present. Not people who enable destructive behavior, but people who see you clearly and still say, you belong here. The article's subjects seem isolated, making anonymous sexual choices with strangers. There's no community to hold them, no witnesses to their worth beyond their sexual performance. They're trying to answer the question, am I valuable, in context where the only possible answer is, you're useful right now. Gregory of Nyssa has this striking phrase in On the Making of Man: every human is stamped with a royal imprint. You're created in God's image. That's the royal imprint. It can be obscured, distorted, covered in mud, but it cannot be removed. Your worth is intrinsic, stamped into your very being at creation. Sexual behavior, good or bad, doesn't create or destroy that worth. It either honors or dishonors it, expresses or contradicts it, but the worth itself precedes and survives all your actions. There's a warning in Proverbs 23:7. For as he thinketh in his heart, so he is he. The person who thinks I'm only valuable if I'm sexually desired will live accordingly, desperately seeking sexual validation, devastated when it's withdrawn, never able to rest in a secure identity. But the person who thinks I'm valuable because God says I am can receive sexual desire as a gift rather than needing it as proof. The locus of identity shifts from external validation to internal reality. Athanasius, in On the Incarnation, argues that humans had fallen into corruption and death, losing the divine likeness. But God didn't abandon us. He became one of us to restore that likeness. Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection don't just forgive sins, they reestablish human dignity. When God himself takes on human flesh, suffers in a human body, and raises that body in glory, he's making a definitive statement. Humans, bodies and all, are worth everything, worth pursuing, worth dying for, worth resurrecting. This should completely reframe the question of sexual worth. You're not trying to prove you're desirable enough to be loved. You've already been loved at infinite cost. You're not using sex to establish value. You're entering sexual intimacy in appropriate context as someone whose value is already established. It's the difference between a beggar trying to convince someone to give them a coin and a prince choosing to share his wealth. One is desperate, the other is generous. The article describes people feeling like ghosts, present but not real. Shame does that. It makes you feel insubstantial, like you might disappear if you're not constantly validated. But there's a moment in Luke's gospel where one of the crucified criminals says to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. This man is dying, powerless as the absolute nadir of social worth. And Jesus responds, today you will be with me in paradise. In his most worthless moment by worldly standards, Jesus sees him, knows him, and promises him eternal value. That's the gaze that heals shame, the recognition that God sees you when you're at your worst and still says, "You're mine." Paul addresses shame directly in Romans 8:1. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. No condemnation, not minimal condemnation if you're good enough, but none. And later in the same chapter, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness? Nakedness, the ultimate vulnerability, the shame of exposure, cannot separate you from God's love. You can be seen fully, known completely, and still held securely. That is why Christian sexual ethics isn't primarily about rules, but about identity. When you know who you are, God's beloved, created in his image, purchased at the price of Christ's blood, you don't need to use your body to prove anything. You can wait for the covenant because your worth doesn't depend on being sexually active. You can reject casual intimacy because you don't need strangers' desire to validate your existence. You can offer your body in marriage as a gift rather than payment for acceptance. There's an eschatological dimension too. John writes in 1 John 3:2, "Dear friends, now we know we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." Your current body, with all its insecurities and imperfections, is not your final form. You're becoming something glorious. Sexual validation can't accelerate that process. Only God's transforming work can. Knowing your glorious destiny should make you less desperate for temporary validation now. In conclusion, early Christianity locates human worthiness not in sexual performance or desirability, but being created in God's image and redeemed at infinite cost, a grounding that liberates people from using bodies to prove value and instead frees them to experience sexual intimacy, when appropriate, as an expression of worth already established rather than an attempt to create it.
Mr. Mick, the article implicitly questions whether people can or should wait, whether resisting sexual impulses in the face of loneliness is even realistic. What did early Christians say about waiting and about formation of desires over time?
This is where early Christianity offers something profoundly countercultural. Because our therapeutic age says you have a desire, you should fulfill it immediately. Anywhere else and anything else is repression. But the fathers would say desires are like children. They need formation, not just indulgence. Waiting isn't punishment, it's education. It teaches your desires to grow up and want the right things in the right ways at the right times. Let's start with Jesus again. In Matthew 4, during his wilderness temptation, Satan says, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus is hungry, legitimately hungry after 40 days of fasting. The desire for food is not sinful, it's appropriate. But Jesus responds, "Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." He's not denying the legitimacy of hunger. He's refusing to let immediate appetite dictate his actions. There's a proper time and a way to satisfy hunger, and magical shortcuts that compromise your mission aren't it. The same principle applies to sexual desire. The desire itself isn't the problem, it's actually part of being human. The question is whether the desire is formed, directed, and fulfilled in ways that integrate your whole person and purpose, or whether it's a tyrant that demands immediate satisfaction regardless of context or consequence. Paul addresses this directly in 1 Corinthians 9:24 through 27. He used athletic imagery. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. I strike a blow to my body and make it a slave, my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Notice he calls it in training, not repression. An athlete doesn't eat whatever he wants or she whenever they want. They structure their diet to serve the goal. She's not hating the body, she's training it to perform at its peak. The same applies to sexual desire. The Desert Fathers developed an entire vocabulary around this. They distinguished between pathos, passion in the disordered sense, overwhelming, compulsive desire, and apatheia, not absence of feeling, but right ordered, integrated desire. The goal wasn't to become an emotionalist robot, but to become someone whose desires align with their values, whose bodies serve their personhood rather than hijacking it. Evagrius Ponticus, in his Practicos, describes the process of desire formation as happening through watchfulness and attention. You learn to notice when a desire arises, where it comes from, what it's really seeking, or whether it's fulfilling it actually serve a genuine good or just provide temporary relief. This requires pausing, creating space between impulse and action. The person in the article seems to have no space. Loneliness immediately triggers seeking casual sex. There's no pause, no discernment, no formation. John Cassian, in his conferences, talks about what he calls the training ground of the heart. Desires are trained over time through repeated choices. Every time you feel a disordered desire and choose not to act on it, you're weakening that natural pathway and strengthening the pathway of self governance. Every time you feel an appropriate desire and wait for the appropriate context, you're teaching your desire to be patient, to trust that good things come to those who wait for God's timing. There's a profound statement in Hebrews 5:14, but solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. Notice, they train themselves by constant use. Moral maturity doesn't happen automatically. It's developed through practice, through repeated choices to discern and act rightly. Your desires don't automatically want the right things. They learn to wait and want the right things through training. The article describes someone overwhelmed by loneliness who teaches and reaches for bodies to solve it. Early Christianity would say you need to train your loneliness to seek appropriate solutions. When loneliness rises, instead of immediately reaching for a dating app or calling the person who's always available but never committed, you could pray. You could call a friend for conversation, not sex. You could journal. You could sit with the loneliness long enough to hear what it's actually saying. These practices train your desire to seek communion rather than consumption. Augustine has this brilliant analysis in On Order, where he distinguishes between privation of good and outright evil. Disordered desire isn't usually desiring something evil, it's desiring something good in a disordered way. Wrong time, wrong person, wrong context. Sexual intimacy is good. Sexual intimacy with a stranger to medicate loneliness is disordered. The formation of desire isn't about killing desire, but about ordering it, teaching it to seek the good thing in the good way. There's also the question of what you're training yourself toward. If you're training your body to expect immediate sexual satisfaction whenever you're feeling lonely, you're forming habits that will make marriage harder, not easier. You're training yourself to use bodies as medicine rather than to offer yourself in covenant. But if you train yourself in waiting, in channeling desire toward appropriate context, in finding non sexual ways to meet relational needs, you're forming yourself into someone capable of actual intimacy when the right time comes. Gregor of Nyssa uses the image of perpetual growth, stretching forward toward God. Desire, properly formed, is always reaching for more, not more bodies, but deeper communion, greater intimacy, fuller union with God, and eventually with a covenant spouse. The person whose desire is rightly ordered is never fully satisfied in this life because they're made for God for infinity, but they're always growing towards that satisfaction rather than grasping at counterfeits. The article's subjects seem trapped in a cycle. Loneliness triggers sex. Sex provides temporary relief, but ultimately deepens loneliness, which triggers more sex. It's like being in quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. The Christian path is counterintuitive. Stop struggling. Stop trying to solve loneliness with bodies. Sit still. Learn to wait. Let your desire be frustrated long enough to discover what you're really hungry for. And gradually, your desire will reorient towards its true object. There's a beautiful promise in Isaiah 40:31. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Notice the progression: soaring, running, walking. The mature person can sustain the long walk, not just the short sprint. Sexual maturity isn't about having the most intense experiences. It's about being able to sustain intimacy over decades through sickness and health, through deserts and abundance. That requires formation. Paul tells Timothy, flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. Notice it's not just fleeing, but pursuing, replacing bad desires with good ones, sexual compulsion with genuine relationships, isolation with community. The formation happens not just through negation, but through substitution. You don't just stop using sex to medicate loneliness, you start using prayer, friendship, service, creativity, and all the other gifts God provides for formation. Basil the Great, in his Long Rules, argues that community is essential for desire formation. You can't form yourself alone because you lack objectivity about your own patterns and blind spots. You need others who can see you clearly, challenge your rationalizations, celebrate your growth, and hold you accountable when you slip. The person in the article seems utterly alone, accountable to no one, with no one to challenge the pattern. Christian formation assumes communal accountability. There's also the Holy Spirit's role. Romans 8:13 says, "But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live." Notice, by the Spirit. This isn't pure willpower, it's cooperation with God's transforming work. You engage your will, you make choices, practice disciplines, but the actual transformation of desire is the Spirit's work in you. You're not alone in this. You're being formed by a power greater than yourself. The ultimate formation is eschatological. In the resurrection, our desires will be perfectly ordered. We'll want what we ought to want with appropriate intensity and will have the capacity to fulfill appropriate desires without frustration or corruption. Paul says we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. We're groaning now, desiring, longing, frustrated, but we're groaning towards something glorious, the waiting, the formation, and the discipline all aim towards that ultimate redemption. In conclusion, early Christianity presents waiting not as repression, but as the necessary training ground where desires are formed to seek genuine goods in appropriate ways, a process that requires patience, community, spiritual cooperation, and hope and ultimate fulfillment, which together make waiting not just endurable, but purposeful.
Mr. Mink, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. People, early Christianity confronted the world deeply suspicious of the body, where touch was often seen as dangerous, corrupting, or morally as unstable, yet responded not by denying the flesh, but redeeming it through incarnation. So, Mr. Mac, would you like to plug in something?
I appreciate the opportunity. Sure. Write the book, grow the business. Connect with me on LinkedIn. GMIC, the Dr. Digital Smith, PhD. Listen to the Dr. Digital podcast and pick up a couple volumes I have on Amazon. That's On Track, Ian Hunter, and Learning America.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Mick, the Doctor Digital, because if you support him for sure, more and more empowering episodes, more empowering books will rise. Please do listen to our other podcasts, Sex 101, of course, Music 101, Mental Health 101, and Love Letters. Please listen to them wherever you listen to your podcasts. So, Mr. Mick, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, sir. Until next time, day is full.
Welcome, people. See you soon.